Hi everyone, Krista Cowan here with another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about common mistakes in genealogy. This is actually part 2 of a presentation I did a few months ago. So when we upload this video to YouTube, I'll be sure that the link to part 1 is in the video description, just right underneath the video window. So if you missed it, you'll want to go watch that one as well. There are a lot of mistakes that can be made in family history research, and we've all made them. And even as experienced of a researcher as I am, I made one just this weekend, a pretty big one, and I'll even talk about it today so that you can see that it happens. The point of highlighting the mistakes is just so that we're more aware of them, so that we pay attention a little bit closer when we're doing our family history research, and so that we make sure that we're climbing the right family trees, our own family trees, and that we're recording the information accurately. So with that introduction, let's dive in. Not going to be a lot of back and forth to the internet or stuff today. We're just going to talk. So if you're listening to this as an iTunes podcast, you're not going to miss a lot if you're not looking at the screen. That's kind of the point of that. So let's just start with number 1. And this is a very common thing that a lot of people struggle with, especially when they're getting started, is not recording what you find. It's so exciting to start clicking on things and to see what records come up and to start exploring them. But if you don't record what you find, you're going to discover that something happens. You'll be looking at a record one day and you'll think, man, this is really familiar. And it might take you a little while, but eventually it's going to dawn on you that you've looked at this record before. The easiest way to avoid redoing your own work or your own research is to make sure that you record what you find. Now, Ancestry.com has provided a lot of tools for that. The most significant one being the ability to attach records that you find. So if you find your family in the 1880 census, make sure you attach that census to everybody in the household so that you know that you found that record. Many of you who've been with me before know that I also transcribe every document that I find into the notes for that person. And I do that on purpose for a few reasons. One is so that I know that I have looked at that record. Another is so that I know that I've read the whole record, so that I've looked at every piece of information on that record. Oftentimes we just look at the age, we look at the birthplace, and we forget that there are other things often included on that record. So I attach it, I also transcribe it. And then you may notice here, and this isn't a great example because I only have 2 documents or 2 things that I have found for her, but I put them in chronological order, and what I end up with is a really nice little timeline, essentially, or life story of this person. It also helps me very quickly to see name consistencies or inconsistencies, age consistencies or inconsistencies. Just helps me to keep track of what I've looked at, what I haven't looked at, where I'm going to find the next piece of information. Now, the second part of this mistake is not just not recording it, but maybe you're recording it in multiple places. This most commonly happens when you have multiple trees. I used to not have a really strong opinion about this. I tried to let people or encourage people to make a decision based on what was best for them. But the more involved that I get in family history, the more I work with you, especially the new people coming into this, and now with DNA, the more that I work with DNA results and cousin matches and trying to figure it out, the more I am becoming a proponent of just one tree. The tools can handle large trees. And so it's not a matter of, your file, like it used to have to have smaller files or things would get bogged down. That's not the case anymore at all. My family tree maker file is massive. It has a lot of media attached to it. I use notes heavily, and I have never had a problem with it slowing down at all. And so that's not an issue. And having all of your family history or family records in one file, in one place, on one tree, is going to save you a lot of headache. You may be having to record people in multiple places, right? Because you have multiple trees. And then what happens if you discover intermarriage on a branch of your family? Now, how do you decide which tree those people go in? Or are you even going to notice? Are you going to end up double doing research because you've got the same people in 2 or 3 trees that you're trying to maintain? And it just becomes not only confusing for you, but it increases the possibility that there might be mistakes made. And as I mentioned with DNA, now you can only attach your DNA results to one tree. And as a cousin, when I find that you have multiple trees out there and you've taken a DNA test, but you've got a tree for your father and a tree for your mother, or a tree for each of your 4 grandparents, I'm having to go to multiple places, and it gets confusing for me as a cousin as well. So I'm a big proponent of one tree for you and for your results, and then making sure that you record that information all in one place. Make sure that you enter everything you find about people, attach records. It just will help keep you sane so that you're not redoing research. It also will lower the possibility that you'll be making mistakes. Now, that leads me to my number 2 point today, or my number 2 mistake today, which is ignoring your ancestors' siblings. When I inherited my family genealogy, one of the things that surprised me as I started looking through it and just becoming familiar with it was how many one-child families I descended from. It was just amazing. And I say that very tongue-in-cheek and with a note of sarcasm in my voice that I hope you can hear. I don't really descend from a lot of one-child families, but looking at my tree, you wouldn't have known that, because various people who had worked on the different branches of my family tree throughout time had only been interested in finding out who the parents were and who the parents were and who the parents were. And so they'd created large sections of my family tree with just one-child families. There are a couple of reasons why we don't want to, there's probably more than a couple of reasons why we don't want to do that. First of all, when you ignore your ancestors' siblings, and I love that I left the S off on that, when you ignore your ancestors' siblings, you are limiting your view of that family. I don't know about you, but the story of my life is about a lot more than just me and my parents. I live with a sister. I have a brother who lives just a couple of blocks away from the office here. I have another brother and his wife and their kids that live about an hour north of us. I have another brother, and our family is very close. I have an aunt. I have several aunts that I'm very close with, and cousins that I adore. All of that is the story of me and of my life. And so if you're looking for the story of your ancestors' lives, look at it in the context of the people that they grew up with and the people that they associated with and the people that they loved and the people that they looked after. And that's important to me. The other reason why it's important to me that we don't ignore our ancestors' siblings is this, and it's strictly a research issue, which is your ancestor may never have had a birth certificate. And whoever was the informant on the death certificate may not have known who the parents were. But if they had 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 siblings, and you start working your way through the siblings, chances are one of them or several of them are going to list their parents on their death certificate. And so now all of a sudden you know the name of the parents, or you've discovered the maiden name of the mother, not because your ancestors' documentation was able to help you figure that out, but because documentation created for the life of one of their siblings or one of their aunts and uncles was able to help you find that missing piece of that puzzle. So that's another reason why this is really, really, really important. There is one more major reason why this is important. We'll get to it in just a minute, and hopefully you'll see the connection here. But let's move on to number 3. And this is a big one, and again, it's something I have very strong feelings about, so I can't overemphasize it. There are 2 sides to this. One is that there are some people who how do I say this appropriately, who devalue the place of women in history. And sad that in this day and age that still happens, but I often look at family trees and people are like, well, I don't know the maiden name, so I just left it blank and I'm going to trace the father's side of the family. And so they just keep going on in this paternal line of their family, and maybe they started their mom's side of the tree and they know their mom's maiden name or they know their grandmother's maiden name, but then it got hard, and so they just overlooked that, skipped that woman, and went straight up that paternal line. Finding the maiden names of women is a little bit challenging sometimes, but it is not impossible. As a matter of fact, if you go back to number 2 here, think a little bit more laterally. Think about other ways. I did a whole presentation on ways to discover the maiden names of the women in your tree. And so maybe I'll link to that one as well. But don't overlook those women. And this is the second part of that, don't just overlook them because you can't find the maiden name. Make sure that when you enter them in your tree, you enter them with their maiden name. And again, there's several reasons for that. I'm a big fan of telling people why things should be the way that they should be. The first one is, if you enter them with their married names, you may not have there's no flag or clue to you that you haven't found her maiden name yet. And here's why. You might not have experienced this yet, but in my family tree, very quickly, I find women who have the same last name as their husband. Their maiden name and their married name are the same. Most often it's because they're related. I've got a lot of circumstances in my family tree of second and third cousins, sometimes fourth cousins marrying each other, and they just happen to have the same last name. Sometimes, and I have a couple of cousins where this has happened as well, it's just coincidental. Jones, Bailey, Williams, those are common surnames, and so they just happen to marry somebody that has the same last name as them. So if you do not know the maiden name of the women in your tree, just leave it blank. It's a good flag to you that you need to go look for that piece of information. It's not confusing things with those women who really do have the same maiden name as their married name. And then another reason has to do with this idea of being able to... I totally just lost my train of thought. I love when that happens. I'll come back to it. We'll get there. It's important to just make sure that you're entering the maiden names of those women and not their married names. Oh, I know what it was. It was what happens if she's been married multiple times. So I have one woman in my family tree, and I'm not remotely exaggerating. She was married 6 times. So what name do I enter, right? And her last husband, she was only married to for a few months before she died. And on her tombstone, that surname is not even referenced. So it gets a little confusing when you start entering them with married names, especially if there's a multiple marriage situation. So enter them with their maiden names, then enter each of their husbands. And if you're using Family Tree Maker or your Ancestry tree, we automatically enter the last names of those men. When you do an automatic search at a Family Tree Maker or out of your Ancestry tree, we recognize that those names exist and are attached to her, but she shows up in your tree with just her maiden name. Okay, number 4, and this is something that we all fall prey to at some time or another. As a matter of fact, just this week on our Facebook page, we asked a question about family myths that have been passed down in your family and whether you've been able to prove or disprove them. And I have just had a ball reading some of your stories. Some of them are hilarious. Some of them are heartwarming. Some of them are a little bit sad. Some of them I just look at and I think, oh no, like we've all heard this story, right? And so let me just caution you that just because somebody has the same last name as you does not mean that you are related to them. And that's not just the case for common names, right? Common surnames like Jones or Williams or Smith, you may have already come to that conclusion that you're not related. But even uncommon surnames, my last name is Cowan. That's not terribly common, but there are at least that I've discovered, 3 very distinct branches of Cowan families in the United States. And as far back as 8 generations, I haven't been able to prove that they cross at all. So just because they have the same last name does not mean that they are related. that also connects with just assuming you're related to somebody famous. My grandmother was a Bailey, and so therefore I must be related to, to Bill Bailey, or like whatever. Fictional characters. We've seen people thinking they're related to fictional characters. That's also probably a big genealogy mistake. It's always amusing to me and a little bit sad. And I don't mean this in a mocking way. I just mean it to kind of jar you a little bit and help you pay attention. When people say they're related to someone famous because they have the same last name, and that famous person isn't even using their real name. They have a stage name. And so again, like, just be careful about how you say how you're related to famous people. A lot of times people want to trace down from that famous person to themselves to find that connection. That becomes an effort in futility and is a breeding ground for multiple genealogical mistakes. So just start with yourself and work your way back one generation at a time in your family tree. And if you happen to come across someone in your family tree that you are related to that is famous, then all the better, because you will know that it's accurate. I've been digging around in a branch of my family tree right now where one of my so many great aunts was married to Daniel Boone, and the families actually moved together through Tennessee and Kentucky into Missouri. And so there they all are with her and her husband, Daniel Boone, and several of her brothers and their wives and children and grandchildren, and they all migrated together. And that's kind of a cool story because it's tied so closely to the Indian Wars and to history and to some of the things that occurred with the expansion into the West, and things that I've heard about my whole life. And now to know that my family was part of that, that's a big deal. That's significant. But it's more significant to me because I've done the paperwork and I've followed the trail and I've proven out these connections, rather than just assuming, oh, I have that last name in my tree, I bet we're related to that person. Okay, hopefully I've driven that point home enough without overdoing it, but also making sure that you know that that's a big deal, and how we throw that around when we're talking to people or when we're posting things on message boards or on social media. It changes the way that people perceive us when we throw some of that stuff out there. So just be accurate about it. Okay, the last point I want to talk about today that I have seen, and this is the mistake I made this week, is skipping a generation. And this one's going to require a little bit more explanation, so hang on with me. I'll use my own family tree to show you where I made the mistake so that you get an idea of how it might happen in your family tree. It also ties very, very closely with this idea of searching out the siblings of your ancestors and also making sure you've got maiden names recorded accurately. Here's how this happened. So I've been going through my DNA matches, and it's been so fun, and it's really exciting to see as other people are connected to people that I've connected with in my family tree. There's a little bit of validation that if they come through one branch of the family and I come through another branch of the family and the DNA says we're related, it's like an extra stamp on my research that I've done this accurately, that I've proven this through the paper, and now the DNA proves it out even more. That's especially true. I have a couple of branches of my family where I'm finding cousin matches through 3 and 4 and 5 of the siblings in the family. And so it's not just one connection, but multiple connections to that single ancestor. So the DNA stuff has been really fun for me, but I pulled up a DNA match this last weekend and started looking at it because I do genealogy on the weekends too. I know, this is my existence. And I discovered that in the tree of my match, she had actually skipped a generation. And now all of a sudden I started questioning all of her research and all of her connections because it was a pretty obvious skip. It was, I think in this case, it was a child who was born about 30 years after the mother died, and the father was about 80 or 85 years old at the time. So it was very impossible that this couple were the parents of this child, and yet she had connected them. And so I decided to start researching the family myself to see if I could figure out what was going on. So I'm going to show you this family in my tree. It's the family of Thomas Lay and Mary Lawrence. And they were married in 1783 in North Carolina. And yes, Mary was only about 14, about 16 years old. But so that's one of the things to look for, to make sure you're not skipping generations. If that woman is younger than about 13 years old when that couple gets married, I think you may have made a mistake. You need to check the records again, make sure that you've got the right person, make sure that you've got the right dates written. Just re-examine your records. So in the South, in my family at least, lots and lots of 14, 15, 16-year-olds getting married, but I have yet to find anyone younger than 13 getting married and having children. So that's a flag. As a matter of fact, anytime you try to enter the birth of a child and the mother is younger than 13, it automatically in Family Tree Maker pops up a little flag or a little warning. It flashes on your screen that says, you might want to check this, okay? Also, if you try to enter children after the mother was 50 years old, it does the same thing. Or after either of the parents are deceased, it does the same thing. So just another one of the reasons why I love Family Tree Maker is because it gives us those automatic prompts that we may have done something wrong, that we're about to make a mistake entering this information. So here I have this couple, Thomas and Mary Lawrence. Mary is an aunt. She is the sister of one of my ancestors, and this is the branch of the family that this DNA match came through, and she had some things mixed up, and so that's why I decided to research it. So I'm researching the sibling of one of my ancestors. Now, I don't know if you can see this or not, but this family, the father's name is Thomas. They have children named Jameson, John, Thomas, William, Lewis, and Nancy. Very, very common names. Now, if we go to John, what you'll notice is he has children named Nancy, James, William, Thomas, Lewis, right? The very next generation, the same names are being used in this family. Okay, not only that, okay, but if you look at Nancy here, the youngest child, she was born in about 1806 in Tennessee. Her older brother John, his oldest daughter's name is Nancy, born about 1810 in Tennessee. So these two women, one an aunt and one a niece, are only about 4 years apart in age. And one of the things that I've discovered is that there's this great marriage record that lists that Nancy Lay was married to William Brassfield, but I don't know which one of the Nancys it is. And so I need to start figuring out ways to differentiate these two women so that I make sure that I haven't skipped a generation. If I've attached William Brassfield, and many people have in their trees, I discovered as I was looking at what other people have recorded and looking to see if anyone else in any other trees had any evidence attached or any documentation attached or any notes attached that led me to records that would show me which Nancy was which, right? Nobody had any proof. And some people had this Nancy married to William Brassfield, and some people had her niece married to William Brassfield. So there's a huge skip in a generation because of this common name, and they're close in age, right? And so what I'm looking for is documentation or maybe an obituary, right? If I can find an obituary in a newspaper that says Nancy Brassfield, daughter of Mary Lawrence and Thomas Lay, then I know it's the aunt. If I find an obituary that says Nancy Brassfield, daughter of John Lay and Nancy Cook, then I know that it's the niece. Okay, so especially in families where you have similar names, one of the most common genealogy problems I see, and like I said, I made that mistake this weekend too. I found Nancy and William Brassfield in a census and off I went, and I had assumed that it was the aunt. And then when I realized, guess what? She had a niece about the same age. I had to completely disconnect that family until I can figure out where William and those children need to be attached. So they're entered, they're sitting in my tree, they're just not attached to either woman until I figure out which woman they need to be attached to, because I don't want to lead anybody else astray with false information. Okay, I hope that made sense. That was a little bit more complicated of a thing to explain, and I thought about it all night trying to figure out how best to explain it to you. But I could probably go through any one of your trees, and I imagine even my own, I may have one or two of these left, where because people have similar names and similar ages and they're living in the same place, and they may even be part, like in this example, of the same family, we attach the wrong people to them. Right? Nancy, who is the daughter of Thomas and Mary, is she the wife of William? That's the question that I'm working to solve right now. So pay really close attention to those generations. And if you haven't researched out or at least documented out your ancestors' siblings, then it's going to be really hard to tell if you've done this. If I had no clue that John even existed, much less also had a daughter named Nancy, I wouldn't have caught this. So I hope that makes sense. That's probably one of the most common genealogy mistakes that I see made. There are others. Like I said, we all make them, but our goal at least should be to get to the truth. We're trying to present an accurate family history. And if we're climbing up somebody else's tree, or if we're just connecting people because they happen to have the same name, or if we're not recording the maiden names of the women in our trees so we don't know where to go to find their parents, all of that is just going to lead to brick walls and frustration and more mistakes and not an accurate picture of who your ancestors were. And I don't know why you do this. I have lots of reasons over the years why I do family history, but one of them is because I really want to know these people. I want to know who they were and how they lived. I want to understand as much as I can about their lives and what it was like for them and what the circumstances were and what the history was behind it. And all of that is discovered through telling these complete and accurate stories about their family history, about their family stories. Until next time, this is Krista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.